One of the more common comments I get on some of my YouTube videos is focused around the behavior of my Mac and how I make the look and feel work. So I thought what I'd do is have a run through about how I set my Mac up and just basically look at some of the everyday utilities that I use. Now, as part of this, we can also look at the performance of this machine. Now, this is one of the late 2016 MacBook Pros, one of the touch bars. It's the basic model, so it's a 2.6 gig i7, 16 gig RAM. Um, I'm not going to go into too much about the machine. It's a great machine from a performance perspective. I get some unpredictable battery life with it, and the other thing, of course, is I think the touch bar is an utter waste of space. But apart from that, it is a great machine. It's not much of a step up from the 2015 model, which is the one I had previously. Um, but if you've got an earlier machine, then it is going to be quite a performance jump. The drive performance on these units, by the way, is fairly spectacular. I mean, here's one of the disk speed reads that I did earlier. You can see that some of the figures you're getting from it are pretty astonishing. Now, this drive is fully encrypted as well, so that performance is actually really impressive. So what we'll do is we'll have a look at some of the utilities that I've got up and running, and I'll take you through why I've got my Mac set up the way that it is. One of the more common questions is, why do I have my dock on the left here? Now, there's a reason for it. Most of my time is spent working on laptops, and what I've found over the years is that the screens tend to be restricted in height rather than in width. Now, because of that, having the dock on the left gives me a little bit more vertical screen room. Now, it's not perfect. It doesn't work particularly well, for example, with multiple displays. Certainly, if you have the dock on the left, sometimes the dock disappears to the wrong screen. But in general operation, it's something I've got quite used to and I really, really prefer. Now, I have that to the point that it's even on the left on my iMac and stuff like that. Now, there are other options, of course, around making the dock auto disappear, but the problem I've always had with that is that I've felt it's taken a little bit too long to appear and disappear. The animation's a little bit too slow. So there is a way of changing that. So if I show you, for example, on mine, if I automatically hide and show the dock, what you should see is that it comes and disappears immediately. So that's another setting that I commonly use. Now, there's a couple of terminal commands to sort that out. I'll include them in the blog article if you want to have a look at that. But personally, I prefer the dock on the left. There are some restrictions, sure, around things like multiple screens. And also, if you've got a lot of apps, those icons can get a little bit small. But personally, I only keep stuff that I use quite a lot in the dock. The rest of the time, I use things like the search, Spotlight search to actually find the apps and the docs that I want to use. So the next one I want to cover, because again, it's one that I use so much I don't really notice it, but it's something called HyperDock. Now, HyperDock is a Windows manager and also manages how your programs appear on the dock. So to show you what I mean, I'm going to start Word and I'm going to open multiple documents. So there's one doc. Let's open another three. So we have a look. We've got 4 Word documents open. Now, what HyperDock gives me is the ability to view all of those windows on the dock bar there. Now, that's very similar to Windows, the way Windows works, and it's one of those functionalities I've got so used to that I really, really like. So you can go through and select which document that you want, and of course, it'll switch to that one. Now, the other thing it includes is the ability to manage windows. Again, very, very similar to Windows. So I can, for example, there, let me get rid of these so you can actually see what I'm doing. So just using a few a few key presses, I can change the position of the windows on my machine. It's a very, very handy thing to do. It'll also do the edge detection as well. So if we've got a small window there and I push it to the edge, it will push it all to the left edge, or if I push it to the right, it pushes it to the right. So really it's simulating a lot of things that you get in Windows in terms of that actual window management. But it's a very, very nice way to operate. So the name of that utility is HyperDock, and again, I'll include the link in the main blog article. Let's have a look at what's up here in the toolbar, because there's quite a bit of stuff up here. Firstly, that one there, that's just the QuickTime recording icon, just shows that I'm recording the screen. This one here is a bit of a legacy app, but basically what it does is it tells me what graphics card I'm using. Now, this laptop has a couple of graphics cards in. Now, I will say this app doesn't work properly on the 2016 MacBook Pro. I think it was initially designed for the 2011 units that had the multiple graphics cards. But one thing it does do is give me alerts and lets me know which graphic card I'm using. Now, that's handy if I'm out and about because battery life on this machine can be a bit unpredictable. And one of the things I've noticed is it's because it's switching to the discrete graphics card when I don't expect it to. I will say in this app here, you'll see, for example, that I've got it set to integrated only. Doesn't always work. It still manages to switch. So I don't think the app is fully compatible with the 2016 version. But it is handy to know, exactly what graphics card that you're using. So the other stuff I have up here, this is a small little app called Free Space. It just tells me what's going on with my hard disk space and also allows me to eject stuff from the toolbar. It's a nice piece of informational app. It's quite useful just to know now and again if I'm doing video editing, for example, I might find that something's just chewed up all my disk space. The other things along here is something called amphetamine. Now, amphetamine is an app to stop your Mac going to sleep. It's quite useful because you can define amount of times that you can do it, how long you want it to be up and running. There's also various settings around whether your screensaver can come into play, for example. Very, very useful app if you don't want your Mac to go to sleep. Now, there's nothing in here that you can't do in terminal. It just gives you a nice front end to it and it makes it really, really simple to use. Other stuff that's up here, well, this one's an interesting one. Bartender, this is known as. There we go. So what Bartender does is takes all of those icons in your toolbar and actually puts them into one menu. So one of the problems you can get with laptops, for example, is that the toolbar up here just gets totally full up with all your small icons from various different apps. So what Bartender does is allow us to take all of those icons and pop them into a single menu. So stuff that I don't use very often, I put into Bartender. Now it's quite handy because what it does is it removes stuff from the toolbar and only keeps things that I'm really, really interested in being in the toolbar available. Now, there's various things in the bartender menu, so let's look at those next. So let's have a look at what's in my bartender menu and we'll just work through them quickly from left to right. That's an icon for an app called Paste, which is a kind of a more flexible paste copy and paste utility. So to show you what I mean, let's jump back to the desktop. I have an ability here to paste multiple entries from my clipboard going back from quite a while. So for example, here you'll see some of the entries around auto hiding the dock, for example, are here. And it will go right back in history to various things that I've copied to the clipboard. So of course I can now go back to pretty much anything that's in my clipboard and copy it. So if I click on that one, for example, now if I pop into text edit, and that's the one that gets pasted. So really it's just a very useful clipboard manager. I find it far more useful than the inbuilt one. We go back to the menu bar up here. Moving across, that one is just my Creative Cloud stuff, so all my Adobe Photoshop and all that sort of stuff. One we've got here is just my Bitdefender antivirus. 1Password, which is of course my password manager. Why people don't use those is just beyond me. Let me get rid of that. Time Machine, of course. There's something called Text Expander, which we'll look at in a moment, and Dropbox, and of course just the configuration for Bartender. Now Text Expander is an interesting little product. There's not a lot you can't do with inbuilt tools, but I like the fact that what Text Expander will allow me to do is copy the settings for this application across all my Macs so they're common. So it does what it says on the tin, really. What it does is it expands shortcuts into full text. So for example, I've got a couple of shortcuts, which is PN, for example, which I use for project notes, which gives me a time and date stamp. There's shortcuts for short date, for example. I use a lot of shortcuts for email searches, for example. So in Outlook, a great ability is to be able to search for emails that have an attachment, for example, that are from an individual. Well, I have a shortcut which is that HAF, which is has attachment, yes, and from somebody. I can also search for has attachment no, and it's basically an app for actually producing lots of different shortcuts. So of course I've got shortcuts for my email. Anything that I find myself typing a lot, I put a shortcode or a shortcut into. The app's pretty good. It'll also suggest shortcuts for you, so it's quite flexible on that front. It's got so embedded into my workflow that I would struggle to be without it, to be honest. I find it a really good app on that front. Switching back to the dock for a moment, there is a great way of providing very fast access to a range of documents. I know there's lots of different ways of doing this, but the way that I do it is I have a folder that I drag and drop onto the lower part of the dock. And in that folder, I've got a number of shortcuts that take me to files that I use a lot. Now, if you synchronize that folder using something like Dropbox, you can make it available on all of your Macs, and it just gives you a very fast way to access common files that you use a lot. So, for example, mine just has access to my accounts. If you look into it, all it is a collection of shortcuts. That's it. And you can, of course, just replicate that across your Mac, and it just gives you very quick access to files that you use a lot or current projects, all that sort of stuff. It's very, very good on that front. So in terms of other apps that I use, there's this one here. This is something called OmniFocus. Now, OmniFocus is essentially a task management tool, but it goes way beyond that. It's more like a project management tool, really, than a pure to-do list. I find it incredibly powerful, and I run most of my work projects and my personal life through it. It's a lot more powerful than a typical to-do list. I mean, for example, if we look at one particular task, you'll see that you've got everything around deferred due dates, how long it's going to take, whether it's repeated. You can add notes to it. I find it an incredibly powerful product. And it also syncs across all your devices as well. Downsides, a little bit expensive. You have to buy a different version, for example, if you want it on your iPhone or your iPad. So, is it worth it? Well, like I say, I'd be lost without it, but I can understand how other people might be put off by the cost. Other stuff that I use, well, I use the Office 2016 suite. It's great, great range. Outlook is so much better than Entourage, if you remember that. Is it quite up to there as the version of Office 2016 within Windows? No, I don't think so, but it's not that far off, to the point that I spend a lot more time now just in Office 2016 on OS 10. I find myself switching to the Windows version far less, so it is far better than it ever has been. What about other apps? Well, this one here that I keep in my dock called Entropy shows that I use it quite a lot. Now, what this is essentially a file compression tool, kind of an OS 10 version of something like WinRAR. Over the years, I've kind of struggled to find a decent file compression utility, but this one seems to meet all the requirements. So, for example, you can just drag and drop stuff in. And once you've dragged stuff in, you can have predefined kind of compression presets. So mine, for example, are RAR, high compression and encrypt, high and split into 3 gig chunks, for example. But you can have as many presets in there as you want. It's a very good tool and it works really well. So, for example, if I just wanted to go RAR high compression, I'd hit that, off it go, and it would encrypt it and leave it on my desktop. It's a great way to manage those files as well. So if I open that, you can see the file in there. I mean, it's a file compression tool, but from OS 10's perspective, it's certainly one of the better ones that I've seen. So what other stuff can I not live without? Well, a major one for me has to be Parallels. So Parallels is a desktop virtualization piece of software. So I run Windows 10 in my Parallels setup. It's a great way to show the performance of these machines, by the way. So if we fire up Parallels, I'll show you what I mean. One thing I'll just quickly point out is while I'm recording the screen with QuickTime here, it does slow the machine down. Perhaps not by that much, but certainly noticeable. So in the real world, this is actually a bit quicker. So what I'm going to do is just fire up my Windows session, and you can see what the performance is like. There we go. So we'll get logged in, and I'll show you what the performance of the actual VM looks like. See, one of the advantages of this model, by the way, is it's so easy to switch between OS 10 and back to Windows, so we can leave that running, doing whatever it wants. And we've still got the multiple desktops. We can do whatever we want in OS 10, and of course I can switch back to my Windows machine. So if we have a look at our Windows machine, let's just look at the specification of it. I can't remember what I've got allocated to this one. There you go. You can see that this VM's got 8 gig of RAM allocated. How many processors? So I've got 8 virtual processors, which of course it's only a quad core, but with hyper-threading, so it'll appear as 8. I'm just going to kill my Skype so we don't get bothered. And we're running an insider preview version of Windows 10 on here. So in terms of the general operation within Windows, I would say that the performance is excellent. This is my everyday working environment, and if it was poor, I just wouldn't use it. The performance in Office is just fantastic and as good as pretty much any other physical machine that I use. And will tell you that absolutely knocks the socks off most corporate machines that I use. There we go. Now I will say it is running a little bit slow, but mainly because we're recording the screen at this point. Now there are some other pretty cool things you can do. For example, I'm running this in full screen. If I just start up Visio and Project there, for example. Now, like I say, we're running full screen, but there are some cool things you can do. Things like changing the view to something called coherence, which I'll show you. So we'll drop out of full screen there and pop into coherence. I will say this is not a mode that I use very much, but essentially what it allows you to do is have just the apps appear within your OS 10 operating environment. So if you're familiar with things like Citrix, it kind of works like that as a published application almost. I will say the performance is not quite as up there. You'll find, for example, you get a little bit of artifacts when dragging things around the screen, but I will say it's perfectly usable. To me, it just doesn't feel as fluid as when running it as a full desktop, so I tend to run it that way. So let's close that down and we will have a look at some of the other things I use. In fact, just before we close this machine down, there is one other thing that I find absolutely invaluable about virtualization, and that's the idea about taking snapshots. It's such a simple thing. So what we can do is we can take point-in-time images or snapshots of the machine. So, for example, if we're doing something that we're not too sure about, it becomes very easy to roll back. So, for example, if I've got a couple of apps running, just fired up Visio and Excel there, for example, and I'm going to, remove something or install something. I'm not too sure about whether it's going to work or not. What I can do is take a snapshot of that machine. So if I do this, pop up to Actions, I'm going to take a snapshot, just give it a name. You can also describe what that snapshot is. And also, because of the performance of the drive on these units, it takes next to no time to produce that snapshot. There you go, it's done. Now, once we have that snapshot, we can go off and do whatever we like to the machine, and we always have a restore point for this unit. So to give you an idea, if I close down this app, okay, perhaps make some changes. If I change the desktop wallpaper or something. There we go. So we've made some basic changes. I've shut down the app, changed the desktop wallpaper. Now, if I wanted to roll back to that previous scenario, it's really, really easy. I've got one button, revert to snapshot. Say, are you sure? There we are. We're back where we were. We've got the apps running that we had running. We're back to the same desktop wallpaper that I had before. So it's a great way of managing your kind of safety around your virtual machine. Now, there are other things you can do. I mean, I rarely shut my machines down. So if I was going to stop my Windows session, for example, what I would do is actually suspend it. So when I start this machine up or unsuspend it, it'll appear back at exactly the same point as it was when I suspended it. There we go. So I'm going to drop out of that now. So that's a run through of my general kind of operating environment and how I use my MacBook Pro. There are some other stuff on here as well, so let's perhaps have a look at those. So one thing you may have noticed up here is this thing here. This is something called Little Snitch, and what this enables me to do is monitor what outgoing connections my Mac is making. So I can see constantly what application is connected to where. It just gives me a better peace of mind that I know what's going on my Mac. If we perhaps have a look into our applications folder, we'll scan through there and see if there's anything else in there that's interesting. 1Password, it's a password manager. I'm astonished more people don't use them. It's a great way to manage all of your passwords from all those different sites. Better Rename is a great little application to rename files into a certain format. So if you're importing large amounts of files that have the wrong file name, or you want them in a different file format, great little app for that. Carbon Copy Cloner, that's a good one for replicating drives and copying all files or synchronizing files between machines. CyberGhost is something I use, which is a VPN client, which enables you to encrypt your internet traffic, and also, if you want, to be able to hide your location, so you can actually pretend to be in a different region. So what else is in here? I don't really use Evernote anymore, so there's some GoPro. Handbrake is quite useful for converting video formats. OmniFocus we talked about a few minutes ago. It's a great project management tool. And that's about it, I think. The Simple Mind is a great app, by the way. This is for kind of a mind mapping piece of software, which if you've never used, let's open it and have a quick look. So this is one, for example, that I produced around disaster recovery, and it really is just a mapping of the kind of things that I need to think about when producing. I think this was for a DR review. It's a great way of getting all your kind of subject into some kind of focus, so you can see what you actually have to produce. And I have to say, it's a really, really simple tool. I don't tend to overcomplicate it. It's really just around getting your ideas into a kind of quantifiable element. There is a free version of this as well, which I have to say is not an awful lot different to the full product, so I'm not so sure whether I'd buy the full product again, but it's a great app for that sort of thing. What else is in here? Of course, Skype for Business I use a lot, Spotify as well. That's about it, really. In fact, this one here is a pretty good one, VSD Viewer. If you're a big user of Visio, you'll know that there's not a app version, sorry, there's not a Mac version of Visio. But what VSD Viewer does is it allows you to view Visio files. That little pop-up there is from Little Snitch, by the way. You can see that VSD Viewer wants to connect to that address on that port, and we've got a choice of what we can allow it to do. So for example, I'm going to allow it to only communicate over 443, and I'm going to set it forever. So that goes into my Little Snitch kind of rule base. But VSD Viewer is pretty useful. We can view and look at pretty much any Visio file, which can be pretty good. So that's about it. That's really how I use my Mac, and it also gives you an indication of what the performance is like on these units as well. So I hope you found that vaguely useful.